The reality of the situation is that we live in a time where Muslims are seen as violent, they're committing terrorist acts, and critics of Islam have argued that these violent acts done by Muslims stem from the teachings of Islam itself. Okay? And there's quotations that people use to argue. There are verses in the Quran that instill hatred and violence towards non-Muslims or infidels. Can you shed some light and help clarify why these accusations are made, and what is the true message of Islam with respect to these verses?
To start with, that assumption itself is unacceptable. Does the Quran indeed teach hatred? I challenge them. Actually, either that they did not look carefully in the Quran, or they misinterpreted certain verses that deal with a specific situation as to how to deal with hostility against you, not initiating hatred towards others. What is there in the Quran that teaches hatred when the Quran makes it clear that God created all humans from the same set of parents, in other words, that they are all one human family? What teaching of hatred in the Quran that says God made people into nations and tribes so that they may get to know and recognize one another? What teaching of hatred is there? Or when the same verse says that the most or the best of you in the sight of God, the most righteous person, is the one who's closest to God? What hatred is there when the Quran and the teaching of the Prophet speak about human beings as one brotherhood, even though they have their differences? What teaching of hate is there when the Quran guarantees the freedom of belief, the respect of other communities, and their entitlement to practice their faith? If there is any intolerance, it is not coming from the Quran. I think we need to understand this. If there is any unjustified violence, it is not from the Quran. It can come from people, not from the Quran. To say that this kind of attitudes or events or violent actions by some Muslims is stemming from the Quran is as poor, if not dishonest, as saying that the violence that was meted against Muslims and Jews as well during the Crusades, during the Inquisition, or the internal violence in the religious wars in Europe, or the violence that's taking place in the world today, which is not only committed by Muslims, are all rooted in Christianity and the noble teaching of Christ. Both are dishonest reading and understanding of the teaching of both faiths, and a severe and serious mix-up between the normative teaching of the faith and the action of people contrary to that faith, either contrary deliberately, or in some cases trying to justify by very poor interpretation of, actually not interpretation, you can call it proof text, just having a foregone conclusion and going to the scripture to seek some kind of justification for this. The Quran does not preach violence, the Quran does not preach hatred. Actually, it preaches, just like all prophets in the past, human brotherhood, love, and respect of each person's right, basic human rights as a human being, and dignity and their freedom. People can coexist, as I indicated in the answer to the previous question, if they have that. But when justice is not there, and when people keep pointing the finger at Muslims, they forget that, like they say, if you point one finger towards someone else, there are at least three pointing back to you. We have to ask ourselves, which community of faith, historically, over hundreds of years, have been perfect? That they've never committed any act of violence? In some cases, even in the name of religion. Name one. It's very hard. But we need to be also fair and humble and realize that if you talk about people, nobody is perfect. There are relative degrees of violation. But in recent times also, it is the sustained injustices against Muslims that give rise to extremist ideas. That's the problem. That's the crux of the matter. I understand that worldwide, almost 1 out of 3 refugees, either misplaced internally or refugees from their lands, is a Muslim. So the fact that Muslims, even though Muslims are not the only ones who are oppressed in the world, Muslims perceive themselves as being severely oppressed and mistreated by bigger powers all over the world, in an atmosphere like that, obviously, there will be some responses, and some of those responses will be against Islam, but by the sheer situation. Why is it that there is no acts of terrorism in Switzerland, in Europe? Because these people are not oppressed, they are free. Nobody is oppressing them. If the situation changed, suppose the Soviet Empire, is revived again and attacking and occupying countries, if you have something similar to the Nazi expansionism in Europe, do you expect that those Europeans who are living in peace and comfort and reject all form of violence would not commit any act of resistance? Did the French people put up any resistance against the occupying Nazi army? You see, so the situation here actually is partly historical. It's not that the whole history of Islam has been history of violence. I think this would be a very extremist interpretation of Muslim history. There were periods where there is deviation from Islam, yes. But you talk about history of 1400 years where for centuries, overall peace, justice, and human brotherhood already had existed among Muslims and their relationship with others.
Can you specifically give maybe one or two examples of some of these verses that are quoted, and what is the proper context?
Perhaps the one verse that has been mostly quoted as the par excellence verse in the Quran that says Muslims are allowed to commit any unprovoked violence against people because of their faith. And by the way, when they quote it, even they make a big mistake, and I'll point to that. They simply says in chapter 9, verse 5 in the Quran, it says, kill the unbelievers, meaning unbelievers in Islam, wherever you find them, seize them and stay in ambush in every place for them. This is a perfect example of what I called before selective cut and paste approach in understanding the Quran. Number one, the verse is quoted from the middle, and the beginning of the verse sometimes is not quoted. Because the beginning of the verse says, when the sacred month has elapsed, then kill or fight against. Now, the reason some people do not quote it is that some audience would say, what does it mean, sacred month? And once they start finding out that there is a historical context, it would contradict the message that people making this propaganda want to convey to them, that Islam teaches violence. Number one. Number two, there is a mistranslation out of either ignorance or deliberately, God knows, but I'm saying objectively, there's a big mistake there. The term in the Quran does not say the unbelievers. It uses the Arabic term mushrikeen, a term which was never used to refer to Jews and Christians as a title or epithet in the Quran. But actually in the historical context and Quranic context, it referred to the idolatrous Arabs in particular. And once you study the history behind it, it does not talk even about idolatrous Arabs in totality, but about a group of idolatrous Arabs, which the remaining verses indicate, who broke their treaty and who actually committed acts of aggression in the first place against the Muslim community. And once you study history, that these are the people who tortured Muslims to death, who negotiated treaties with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, only to betray it and cold-bloodedly kill innocent people. You talk about people who are atrocious war criminals. It doesn't say kill even every. And if people look honestly, not just at that verse or part of the verse is quoted, look at the verses from 1 to 15 or 14, you find, once you study it carefully, that it deal only with that particular situation of aggression. And even it say if they cease their aggression, then leave them alone. It is not because they are idolatrous Arabs, but because of their aggression against Muslims. For someone to take this out of its textual context, out of its background historical context, and say the Quran say kill the unbelievers, is the ultimate of, I say, inappropriate statement to be made.
Thank you for the clarification.